Imagine you and your neighbors owned a business together. Maybe it's your local grocery store, bookstore, coffee shop, or artist studio. Maybe it's the place you work, the place you shop, or even the housing community where you live. Now imagine something important needs to change. Prices are going up, staff are feeling stretched, members want more local products. Who decides what happens next? Does one person decide? A manager? A board? Does everyone vote? And how do you make decisions without everything slowing down or turning into conflict? This is where governance comes in. Governance is simply how a group of people makes decisions together and stays accountable to each other. Every organization has to make decisions. Who sets the strategic direction? Who is responsible when something goes wrong? And how do people have a say in what happens next? In most traditional businesses, governance focuses on protecting investors, maximizing profit, and driving financial performance. Cooperatives are different because they are owned and run by their members. The whole reason why cooperatives exist is to meet the needs of these members. Governance builds in checkpoints to decision-making powers. It sets clear boundaries on accountabilities and creates clarity for everyone. It means that the organization has clear understanding of how to deliver the best for the members and run a successful business all at the same time. That means governance can't just be about oversight. It's about balancing voices, making decisions together, and protecting the purpose of the organization. As cooperatives grow and change, they need clear ways to make decisions, share responsibility, and stay accountable to their members. There isn't just one way to do this. Cooperative governance exists across a spectrum of approaches, shaped by who the members are, how they participate in the organization, and what the co-op is trying to achieve. For many people watching this video, especially co-op developers, governance isn't something you choose for a group. Your role is often to help groups understand their options, think through trade-offs, and build systems that reflect their values and realities. In this video, we're going to explore part of that spectrum by bringing two experienced practitioners into the conversation. Each will walk us through a different approach to governance that cooperatives commonly use. On one end, we'll look at policy governance, a model often used in larger consumer co-ops, including many grocery cooperatives. This approach focuses on clarifying roles between boards and management, setting direction and accountability. On the other end, we'll explore sociocracy, an approach often used in worker cooperatives and highly participatory organizations. Sociocracy emphasizes structured participation, shared decision-making, and strong communication between teams. These examples help illustrate how governance systems can work in practice, but they aren't fixed destinations. Many cooperatives adapt, combine, or evolve governance systems over time as their membership, size, and needs change. Governance isn't about choosing the right system once and getting it perfect. For groups, it is trying something that resonates with you, often guided by a co-op developer, and making it work for your team. For cooperative developers, the work is often about stewardship, helping groups reflect, adapt, and evolve governance as their cooperative forms, grows, and changes. Before we explore these approaches more closely, let's start with some common myths about cooperative governance.
So I think we grow up in a world where education and cooperation are not taught properly, and the experiences of people cooperating with each other are disastrous. So whenever I talk about cooperatives to other people, their experience is, or their thoughts is like, oh, I don't want to be like having to pull the weight of other people who are not competent. And I think it scares people.
The biggest myth and misconception is the idea that collective decision making is difficult or hard to do and is inefficient. People are so used to a hierarchical decision making from a director to a manager, right, that they can't even imagine how you can make decisions as a collective, or that it is, or they assume therefore is not as effective or efficient, where it can be efficient and can be effective, but it's based on relationship and trust, which is very different than what we have in most capitalist structures. And so having the ability to see it in action and practice it is really important so that people can let go of that myth.
When I first incubated a cooperative, it was a cleaning services cooperative, I imagined that collaboration would look like everyone kind of working on the same things. And as I learned more about how cooperatives get developed, I learned that everyone is working on their strengths. And so it's everyone's individual strengths coming together to build something and work through those capacities and build capacity in that way. So I think a myth for me was, oh, everyone is going to be doing the same things. But no, in reality, you are going to know yourself, know what your strengths are, and bring that to the cooperative. And that brings the strength and the power.
We've just heard some myths about governance. But what is governance? Essentially, at its core, governance is the system used to organize decisions, distribute authority, and stay accountable. Cooperative governance sits on a spectrum, from strict and formal to less formal and flexible. We have brought in a couple of experts from our network to tell us a bit more about governance and explain a couple of systems that you often see cooperatives use. Keep in mind that, in the words of cooperative scholar Karen Miner, once you've seen one co op, you've seen one co op. So the governance systems you help co ops design may look different. Ready to meet our experts? Let's hear their introductions and then we will dive into understanding governance systems, theories of governance, and their favorite types of governance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Berner, and I'm the Executive Director at the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives. The center has been around since 1962. We do a range of outreach, education, and research activities on cooperatives. We also have a co-op development program, which is actually how I got my start in cooperatives, was helping people start new cooperatives around the state of Wisconsin. So we're located in Madison, Wisconsin, but we serve the whole state. And so I actually took a class on co-ops when I first moved to Madison for grad school, and through that course got really interested in how the co-op model could be used in the context of regional food systems, and then eventually ended up working at the center, and I actually teach that class today.
My name is Ted. I live in Massachusetts right now, and I teach governance, and I help organizations with governance that care about making decisions really as equals. So I co-founded an organization that's a nonprofit called Sociocracy for All that helps people do that. And really one big thing that we want to do is just give people access to this kind of knowledge, because most of us, we go through life and we only know about hierarchy and we know about maybe making decisions together in some way, but not with the level of sophistication that is often needed for organizations. So we want to give people options so they can choose systems that work better for them. I myself live in a co-housing community. That's also how I got introduced to these kind of things. So I use sociocracy at work. I use sociocracy and in the place where I live. So it's all over really for me.
In this video, you'll learn about the inner workings of some detailed governance systems. But before we can explore these systems, we will need to tackle the basics. We will explore the following questions. What is governance? Why do you need clear governance systems? What are some theories of governance, and how governance systems are adopted as cooperatives?
Because governance for me is all the decisions of who decides what, how do we decide, on what basis.
If we look at the word governance, it has its roots in the Latin word gubernare, which derives from the Greek kybernon, meaning to lead, to steer, to be the head of, to set rules, to be in charge of the power. Governance is related to vision, decision-making processes, power dynamics, and accountability practices. The ultimate goal of governance is to effectively fulfill an organization's goals in a way consistent with the organization's purpose.
In cooperatives, governance refers to the structures and processes by which members control their cooperative and participate in decision making. So, cooperative governance and the various things it entails are how cooperatives operationalize co op principle number 2, democratic member control. So, that principle states that cooperatives are democratic organizations that are controlled by their members who actively participate in setting policies and making decisions.
The more clarity there is, the more easily people can be empowered. It's just basically a pattern language to decide who decides what. So ultimately, what you need is some sort of written down system, like the rules of a board game, right? That defines how you decide things, and especially how you decide who decides, because that gets so often forgotten, and then we're locked into a system where we don't know how we can change who's deciding what.
Now that you have a basic understanding of what governance is, take a moment to pause and apply these learnings to your co-op.
So some people might ask, why bother setting up these complex structures within a business? Why does this matter? I would argue that co-ops are people-centered businesses that exist to meet the needs of those people, of the members. And if that promise is going to be realized, then the co-op needs mechanisms, sometimes complex ones, for understanding and channeling the will of those members.
Without clear governance, co-ops often run into the same problems: meetings where nothing gets decided, boards micromanaging staff, or power concentrating informally instead of democratically.
This figure does a really nice job of illustrating the relationships between members, the board of directors, and the employees of a co-op. So members elect the board and approve changes to the bylaws and other major decisions. The board of directors is essentially entrusted with the will of the members to oversee the cooperative, hire management, supervise their work, make sure that management is carrying out the will of the members, and then management hires employees who run the cooperative on behalf of members. In worker cooperatives, of course, all or some of the employees are members and thus can also serve on the board. In most cooperatives, the members elect a board from the membership to govern on their behalf. What is the point of the board of directors? Why does it exist? And the answer to that question really depends on who you ask. Different theories of governance answer that question differently. I would argue that each of these theories and the role of the board that these theories support really apply to cooperative governance in one way or another. They all hold truth, though none of them are the truth about cooperative governance. So the dominant theory of corporate governance, which is called agency theory, assumes that the owners of an enterprise and those who manage it have different interests, different priorities. So in that case, the main function of the board is to control managers and ensure they act in the best interests of owners. In contrast, the stewardship theory assumes that managers will effectively steward the organization in accordance with the desires of owners, so the board and the manager are better seen as partners. In this case, the board's role is to use their unique perspectives and expertise to add value to decision making. The stakeholder theory is based on the assertion that organizations have a responsibility to a wide set of stakeholders beyond just the owners. In that case, the main function of the board is to understand the potentially conflicting interests of those various stakeholders, and then sort of synthesize them and take them into account when determining the strategic direction of the business. Lastly, the managerial hegemony theory argues that while shareholders or members may own the business, true control has effectively been ceded to managers. Even though this theory was developed in the study of large corporations, many of the things that it describes seem just as relevant to cooperatives, especially as certain co-ops grow in size and have professional managers with more experience in the corporate world, perhaps, than in the cooperative one.
Take a moment to pause and consider these questions. Which governance theory best describes your co-op right now? Is there a theory that you aspire to for the future of your co-op? What steps might you take to get there?
Ultimately, having a system is what makes the difference between just an informal structure where all the typical biases and so on come through, right? And having an intentionally placed, embraced, agreed upon system that we understand.
So when I sort of think about the basic underpinnings of governance in co-ops, there's a couple things. And sometimes I break them up when talking to folks who are thinking about doing co-op development work, break it into three buckets. The culture of the people that are involved, the state statutes where the co-op is incorporated, and sort of the systems and documents and processes that the co-op puts in place to make sure that the will of the members is channeled through the board, and that the board sort of has the right sets of policies and procedures in place to make decisions. Generally, there's a group of people that get together and explore the question sort of informally of, is it a good idea for us to cooperate? You know, is there anything here? Is there a collective problem or opportunity that we want to take advantage or not take? So a collective problem we want to solve or an opportunity that we want to take advantage of together. And typically what happens is that group, and there are different ways to describe that group, but that initial group that's coming up with an idea or has an idea um, morphs into a more formal steering committee, and that steering committee is really tasked with exploring the feasibility of that initial idea. What would it take in terms of recruiting members? What would it take in terms of building the business? It might involve a market study. It might involve um, sort of exploring potential partnerships, all sorts of things. But is this feasible? And if the answer to that question is yes, typically what happens is that steering committee will file the articles of incorporation, or whatever it's called in the state that you're in. In Wisconsin, they're called articles of incorporation, with the state, and establishes a co-op. And those articles spell out some really basic characteristics of the co-op. How many classes of members, some other things, the name of the co-op, stuff like that. And so once those are filed, the co-op is a legal entity. And like any type of business, cooperatives file at the state level, and thus sort of use the forms of business that are available to them in that state. And not long after, so at least in Wisconsin, the people who sign those articles of incorporation become the initial board of the co-op, and then within a certain number of months, that new co-op has to hold its first election for directors, which come from the members. So essentially what happens is you have a sort of informal organizing group that, as they coalesce around an idea, turns into a steering committee, which further explores the feasibility of that idea. Should they decide to move forward, yes, it's feasible. They incorporate it as a business. Um, that steering committee is often the group of people that signs the articles of incorporation, becomes the initial board, and then you're off to the races. And so um, typically along that continuum, that group is putting things in place, both in terms of culture, but also in terms of documentation and structures that sort of support this burgeoning a democratic association part of the business. And so the bylaws spell out certain things about how decisions are made and who has authority to make them, and how directors are elected and things like that. And then, culture and norms are developed. This group of people is meeting regularly. And so as a developer, one of the roles is helping people, make sure they are drafting agendas and taking notes at their meetings. One of the things about starting a business with other people collectively is that it's really important that things are written down and that there's a shared understanding of both what you're doing on the business side, but also how you've agreed to make decisions together and move through um, different processes.
Take a moment to pause and discuss the following questions with your group. What are bylaws? How does a group develop culture and norms? How has this worked in your co-op? What is the role of a cooperative developer in getting a group started?
Boards generally have the following responsibilities. They should be safeguarding the assets on behalf of members, so protecting the cooperative on behalf of members. In doing so, one of their key responsibilities is hiring the manager and supervising them. They develop and guide strategy. They assess how the co-op is performing and work to preserve its character on behalf of members. They're responsible for the whole governance structure, for making sure that it's strong and that they both have people coming into it, and that the processes and policies and culture in place support effective, healthy governance. They both serve as trusted advisors to management, and they also need to push back against management when it's necessary. They represent members and communicate back out to members. And lastly, and sometimes most difficult, this is the most difficult part, they're really responsible for aligning the co-op strategy with members' short and long-term interests, which are sometimes in conflict. So board members are expected to carry out their responsibilities according to three key duties: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. I won't get into the details about these duties. You can read about them online very easily. Essentially, the board needs to be paying attention, doing the best to monitor how the cooperative is doing on behalf of the members, and they need to do so within the laws that apply to them, and they need to have loyalty to the cooperative.
Take some time to pause and apply. Consider the following questions. What should boards be accountable for? What is your board accountable for? Or what will you hold them accountable to? How will you make sure that boards understand their accountabilities? Now that we've covered what cooperative governance is and why it matters, let's look at some of the governance systems co-ops can use in practice. Courtney and Ted will walk us through two common approaches, the Carver model of policy governance and Sociocracy, and explain how each one supports clear decision-making and accountability. Recall that once you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op. So the way that you support cooperatives to implement governance models may operate exactly like Courtney and Ted present them, but they may also look slightly different or be a blend of these models. Both of these governance systems are similar in many ways, but also have key differences. With the knowledge about these systems, you'll be able to create stronger co-ops.
The Carver model, so the full name is the Carver model of policy governance, and I will just refer to it as policy governance. But the Carver model was developed by John Carver and later his wife Miriam Carver, and it is basically a set of principles through which the values of an organization and the mechanisms for delegation and accountability are codified into a set of policies.
Sociocracy, I want to explain the word because actually some people use a different word in the US in particular. So the term in the US that sometimes is used is dynamic governance. The word sociocracy, though, means socios and cracy, right? Those who associate together govern together. So if you want to say it in one slogan, it would be those who do stuff together decide together. And that's different, or it's, I guess, a deeper version of democracy where, the masses decide and everybody can participate by voting, for example. Here, it's those who do stuff together decide together. So what sociocracy is, it's a governance system. Many of us know the systems of, well, the boss decides, or maybe somebody has been around a system where when the decision needed to be made, everybody just comes together and we talk until we've decided. But sociocracy is a system that's kind of right in the middle between those two, because we're not deciding everything together, but we form what we call circles. So these are groups that focus on a particular aspect. For example, in my housing community, those people who primarily work in the garden are the decision makers on the garden. Like, I go there sometimes to harvest stuff, or like do whatever, help weed a little bit, but really I don't have any business in the garden. I don't know what's where, honestly, or what the plan is. So I'm totally happy for other people to decide. And accordingly, in all the different other aspects of my community, like, let's say, in the people who deal with all the lists and Google Drive and whatever, like, all the data stuff, I am not involved in that, and I'm totally happy for other people to do it and also decide along the way. My community is a good example also because it used to be run differently. So let me tell that story, and with that story, I think I can explain what sociocracy is. So it used to be that when a decision needed to be made, every Saturday, once a month, or like once every month on a Saturday, everybody would come together and make all the decisions. And those were several hours meetings. This is 70 people. So it was a lot of talking. And what happens now is that we divide up all the decisions that need to be made in the community, like the garden, or like the data stuff, or the community building, and all of those different parts. And those who primarily work in those areas then join the team that we call circle, and they are the decision makers. And then we have a way of connecting all those circles so that everything is always a part of something. Like, for example, the people who deal with the things in the common house and the community building basement, they are a subset of the people who build with the overall building. So everything has a place kind of where it naturally belongs. So that way we have a sense of how everything is structured, and we have those small groups that focus on their particular area and then get to make decisions there. So it's a very organic way of really doing it, and it provides that clarity without having one person or one group in charge. So it's a neat in between a hierarchical system that's super top down with very few decision makers, and that super hyper inclusive version of everybody deciding everything together. It's right in between, and that makes it, to me, it really hits that sweet spot between participation and just being able to go do stuff.
Policies are these policies fall into four distinct categories of ends policies, executive limitations policies, board process policies, and board CEO relationship policies. Um, so just to sort of walk through the four different types of policies that I just mentioned, the ends policies specify the organization's purpose and the organizational results that the CEO or GM or executive director, whatever want to, however that person is referred to in the organization. So the ends policies specify the organization's purpose and the organizational results that the manager is working toward. The executive limitations policies articulate the boundaries of the CEO's authority. So, in other words, the things the CEO or general manager cannot do in pursuit of those ends. And these two sets of policies are really important and work in conjunction. So the point of them is basically to tell the manager, this is where we want you to go. This is what we want you to accomplish. Um, Come up with your best strategy for taking us there. Just don't do these things. So that's how the ends policies and the executive limitations policies work. And they're designed really to give the manager the freedom to use their professional expertise to come up with the best strategy for achieving those ends. while also putting some limitations on those things that the board wants the manager to not do in pursuit of those ends. So the other two sets of policies are really about the board's work. So the board process policies are about how the board accomplishes its work. They might cover topics such as board training and development, agenda setting, the cost of governance. And then lastly, the board CEO relationship policies describe how the board and the CEO work with one another.
So there are different parts to it. The first one is learning, right? I once had somebody that was quite cute, actually. Somebody who was in a workshop and said, "This sounds great. How can I do this starting on Monday?" Without training anybody. But as we all know, culture doesn't just shift because you decide so, right? It's something that we need to do proactively. So training is a part. The other part then is to start defining really what those areas of decision making are, right? Like it might be very close already to the structure that the group has. And then really just being very clear on what is exactly that sandbox that you have so that people can really be empowered. Because my experience is the more clarity there is on who decides what, the more empowerment there is. So part of a more dynamic governance solution is to have a system where you know how you can change it. And that means having a set of rules or like agreements written down of how it works and getting buy-in on that, whatever that means. So often it's the board that needs to opt in, for example, or the whole membership or whatever it might be. But ultimately, having a system is what makes the difference between just an informal structure where all the typical biases and so on come through, right? And having an intentionally placed, embraced, agreed upon system that we understand.
Does not dabble in policy governance. It is a comprehensive system, so you are either using it or you are not. Um, if folks are interested in learning more about what the model looks like, understanding how to implement it, the Carvers have written several books on the model. They're boring and they're very long, but reading at least one of them is really important if you're considering adopting this model or just want to bring this model to your board or group to consider it. And I kind of hate to say this, but if a co-op is seriously considering policy governance, I highly recommend hiring a consultant to help. A consultant can be really helpful on the front end with educating the board and management on the model and how to use it. They also could be instrumental in helping to draft policies and implementing the system once you begin using it.
Well, it's best for groups that already come with that value set of self-organization, right? Figuring things out ourselves. It is also going to be hard, and that's what makes it so good for co-ops too. Imagine a system where one person owns the company, right? And legally it's completely theirs. They can do whatever they want, right? Sell it or whatever. Um, and now that person tries to introduce sociocracy and tells everybody that now power is shared, right? It's clear that there's going to be a limit in how credible that will be, right? Because you can't really detach the governance and decision making from the legal side and the ownership. So that's why groups where this works really well are often nonprofits. They're often co-ops. Or then there are organizations where they are I want to say in transition because I've worked with organizations, for example, companies, where there's some sole proprietor that introduced sociocracy, and the next thing I hear from them a year later is, oh, and now we're thinking about becoming a co-op because they can't deal with the cognitive dissonance, right? Of now governance is shared, but ownership is not. So yeah, that I guess answers the question of what are the kinds of groups. Well, it's groups that are either already there in that egalitarian frame on all the different levels, or they're on their way there.
All right. So who uses policy governance? Within the cooperative community, adoption of policy governance is highest, I would say, among food co-ops, so consumer-owned food co-ops. I'm also familiar with it being used by credit unions. I've worked with a purchasing co-op that uses policy governance, but I think it's most commonly used in grocery co-ops. And it makes sense that it is mostly used by consumer co-ops. They tend to have larger membership bases, they tend to have an elected board, and a CEO or general manager. I would say that policy governance certainly does not make sense for co-ops that use direct democracy or for those that do not have a CEO or a general manager. What are the things that make policy governance hard? Why do people love to hate it? It's complicated. There is a learning curve, and not everyone on the board needs to be a master of policy governance for it to work. But you need a baseline level of proficiency across the board for it to be implemented effectively. I mentioned this earlier. People complain that it's rigid. People like structure, they want structure, but then they push back against it. I think there's some of that. I've heard people say that policy governance and the way that monitoring reports are structured makes them feel detached from the work, like they don't actually know what to do when issues come up. Um, Other complaints I've heard is that policy governance gives too much power to general managers and CEOs, and boards can feel like they are just rubber stamping. So I will say that all of those criticisms that I've heard of policy governance, I've also heard of like the board experience in general. I think a lot of frustrations with policy governance. I don't think policy governance is a panacea, but I think that a lot of the frustrations with the model are the result of a few things. One, board members not understanding it, CEOs and general managers not fully understanding it, and it just not being used to its full potential. Um, like any operating system, whether it's on a computer or whether it's for our governance system within a cooperative, if we don't really understand it, we're never going to be able to use it to its full potential. And so I think a lot of the frustration with policy governance stems from that. But I want to acknowledge again that there is a steep learning curve and it's fairly complex. And so, in order to get around that, requires really a commitment from an organization to education and training.
And there are two typical things. One is just simply not enough training. That kind of goes to the quote that I brought of the guy who wanted to use sociocracy without training anybody. That just doesn't work so well because we are, as you said, we are in these hierarchical systems. That's the air we breathe, right? That's what we resort to. So, in order to really intentionally step out of that, we need to do things differently, and that means learning. And that also, for example, learning means learning facilitation techniques, right? Like, what do you do if somebody objects? How do you just stay super calm and relaxed about it? Because there's, you know how to manage and how to address it. How do you make sure that the facilitator is not the only one problem solving, but everybody in the group? Like, those are all skills that can be learned and that really change the culture in all of those little ways. So, not enough training is a problem. The other one is, and that gets a little harder to explain, I guess. Those who are very committed to hierarchical thinking, they might never fully let go of it, right? If people find themselves thinking things like, well, sometimes somebody just has to decide, it's like, yeah, those are the behaviors that then sometimes shine through, especially in times of crises, that then undermine the system because then people lose trust, right? But in the same way, actually, on the other extreme, it can also happen that people still buy into these, like, oh no, and everybody should really be asked on everything, because that's not what sociocracy is, right? Sociocracy is really that very intentional placing of power into smaller groups. So if people still have the expectation that they're going to be asked on everything and can veto everything, then they're just going to be miserable with each other. So it's interesting how the resistance comes from both sides. The very hierarchical people and the super horizontal people, because as I said, sociocracy lies in the middle. And then there are these poles in those two directions that can undermine the whole thing. I'm going to add one thing because I find it interesting. that is kind of the positive example of what makes it really work well. And that for me is when people choose to opt in, like they choose to give themselves a system because they truly believe, as I do, that having a system helps me show up as the better version of myself. Like if I'm, for example, in a facilitated space, I know I operate better than when I'm not. So to me, I want to create a situation in my organization where everything is like the counterpart of facilitated, right? There is the clarity, and we have the agreements about how we interact with each other and what we do when we disagree and so on. So to me, having a system is really something that I embrace. And if people try to cut corners all the time and basically um, kind of eat away at that structure, then again it can fall apart. But if you have a bunch of people really willingly embracing it fully, that's a really smart move to have a system that is smooth.
The things that I will say in its favor are, one, it is helpful to have a cohesive framework or operating system. I think of policy governance as an operating system. And policy governance doesn't tell you what to do exactly, but it does tell you how to do it. And there, as far as I know, there aren't other comprehensive systems out there of governance. People ask me all the time if I know of one, and I have not yet come across one that is as cohesive or comprehensive of a framework. Um, and so, when it is well understood and effectively implemented, policy governance should help the board do some of the things we talked about earlier about doing sort of carrying out their responsibilities. It should help them to stay focused on the issues that matter. It should help them delegate confidently and with clarity. Should help them keep tabs on how management is performing without, getting their fingers in the weeds. And when used well, it should help them evaluate the accomplishments of both the organization and that top manager.
Take a moment to pause and apply. Discuss the following questions with your group. What elements do you like the most about policy governance? What about sociocracy? Are you currently using policy governance or sociocracy? Does one of these systems feel like it would work better for your co-op, and why? Now that we've heard a little bit about what governance is, why governance is important, and the details of two commonly used governance models, let's circle back to a few of the myths that developers have heard about co-op governance.
Something that happens with decision making, collective decision making, it's this misconception about decision that can be the day-to-day, like operation decisions, like day-to-day basis that does not necessarily need a whole assembly or a board of director to make those decisions.
People think about co-ops, they sometimes think everything needs to be decided together, right? And I remember a food co-op that I worked with. They basically had a system where everybody was sort of trying to decide everything together. And then what we did was we were able to tease apart who decides what, right? And that was just insanely liberating because everybody had been holding the responsibility for everything. And everybody felt really kind of weighed down by that. And then we were able to distribute it and have that clarity. And they were all like totally feeling light about it and just so motivated to jump into their piece. So that was great. Then I remember another situation where an organization was heavily board run, despite all their efforts to kind of let the team decide more, but they felt so responsible again. I think it goes down to the responsibility, right, that locks people in hierarchical situations because they thought they had to decide and make sure everything is going well. And again, we defined who was deciding what and how it all works. And all of a sudden they were able to let go some of that and really let the staff come into their own power. So that was a beautiful moment. Beautiful thing to watch when that happens.
I mean, I know that one of the myths was that everyone makes all the decisions or something, like everyone's. And that is really not true. I mean, I think when we talk about efficiency in meetings, there are some co-ops in which maybe that level of detail is discussed in the boardroom. Maybe it's a really small direct democracy co-op where more decisions are made by that body than another co-op. But in most co-ops, the board, the goal is for the board to stay at a higher level. Its responsibility is oversight, helping to guide strategy, supervising the manager, making sure members are informed. It is not picking paint colors. It is not, um, selecting products for the co-op shelves. Um, it is not choosing which new truck to buy to go pick up milk. It is not those things. And so um, co-op boards that are doing, carrying out their role are not, their most decisions operationally are made by staff. Again, look slightly different in smaller co-ops and worker co-ops and housing co-ops where a lot of those decisions directly impact people's livelihood either through where they live or where they work, and so it makes sense that more decisions would be pushed down to that member level or be made at the board level than in a large agricultural co-op, in a credit union, or a big food co-op. So some of it is the ways in which people are involved in decision making, the structures that are set up, they need to scale and grow and evolve as the co-op scales and grows and evolves, if it does. And so that's part of why we see such variation in governance models and structures and practices across the cooperative community. Set up, they need to scale and grow and evolve as the co-op scales and grows and evolves, if it does. And so that's part of why we see such variation in governance models and structures and practices across the cooperative.
So I think a myth for me was, oh, everyone is going to be doing the same things.
So to the myth, when people hear co-ops, they sometimes think, oh, co-op, that means everybody decides everything together, and we imagine like 8-hour meetings in large groups, and I wouldn't want to do that either. So really imagining instead like the small agile teams, well connected, that's what it can look like, right? The other piece is that what I've noticed is that over the years in particular, people are so savvy around process and really taking process seriously and embracing it as something that can help us, right? Help both the thing that we're trying to build together and just each other as human beings, like having these safe containers and the clarity of structure and how things are done. So it doesn't have to be slow and tedious anymore. There are really all these processes, and people have become better at doing those processes together in a way that really is fun and compelling.
One of the things that there's two things when it comes to co-ops. There's understanding the model and what it does in the world, what it does not, how it's structured, how they work. And then there's the stories, there's the stories of co-ops that are out there, whether it's, the story of a vet clinic that converted to a worker cooperative in rural Wisconsin and has saved these jobs in this community and this local vet clinic to, um, a farmer co-op that's helping immigrant farmers sell produce into grocery stores. I mean, there's stories and then there's the model, and um, I think that both are important. Sort of understanding the fundamentals and also steeping yourself in some of the inspiring stories and in some of the failures too, and what worked and what didn't work. So I think follow your interests. Co-ops are a niche, but there's also a lot within that niche, and there are a lot of pathways into co-ops and ways to use them to help people.
How a system like Sociocracy requires a really good sense of our own power, of our own agency, individual agency. And only if we're able to hold that boundary well? Can we kind of play on that collective level, right? If, for example, I mean, what I mean is fairly obvious. If we have a group and somebody's constantly spilling their personal stuff, right, their personal issues into the group is not going to get around to doing things, right, or less so. So that's what I mean. We have to kind of hold our own boundary, and in a way, the group depends on me having clarity within myself. For example, do I want to be here, right? If I'm constantly questioning that, it's not going to be helpful for the group. But there's only so much that the group can do to help me gain that clarity. Really, it is the personal responsibility to show up in a way that's ready to show up for the organization. And there's limited things we can do from the outside. We're kind of depending on people's personal work, which is also which is also why I like when it's combined with personal work for people. So there's a lot there. It's not just one, governance is not just one of those isolated systems where you just change that one.
I will mention our website first. So the UW Center for Cooperatives, we have a whole area in our on our website that talks about cooperative governance. I'll mention again our Cooperative Governance Research Initiative, which is the first ever longitudinal study of cooperative governance practices across sectors and over time. If you are interested in learning more about governance in the context of cooperative development and helping people start new cooperatives, I highly recommend the Art and Science of Cooperative Development training. I typically do the governance trainings that are part of that series. I went through it. I don't want to count how many years ago now when I was gearing up to be a cooperative development specialist myself. Um, I will also mention that within different parts of the co-op community, there are a lot of resources made available. So within the food co-op space, Colluminate has a ton of resources on co-op governance. The rural electrics have their own set of resources. Worker co-ops, between the ICA group and the Democracy at Work Institute, they have some resources. St. Mary's University, they've done some really interesting. Sonia and Karen at St. Mary's have done a lot of great thinking on cooperative governance as sort of in the context of being people-centered organizations. So I suggest checking out their website and a lot of their thinking.
We offer quite a few, of course, right? Sociocracyforall.org. As I said, we really started Sociocracy for All because we wanted to have it in the commons, like so that people have access to this information. There's one particular training that I know has been useful in this kind of space where people are interested in self-organization, for example, in co-ops, and that's a set of video recorded sessions. Happens to be me who recorded it because I don't mind being recorded. That's why I'm here, and my colleagues are not. So it's a video that I imagine it like it used to be when one learned languages when I was, I don't know, young. And you kind of go back and forth between the video and then the group. So let's say the video says, let's try this and that process, where you do this and that, and then it stops. And then the group does that, and then they go back to the video. And the cool thing about that is that a group can get trained without needing a trainer right there. So it's super affordable. That's cool. And the other thing is that I've just heard again and again, and hundreds of groups have done that by now, that they really click with each other because they spend so much time together and really learning it together. So it seems to somehow really work well for groups. So that's an option. And then there's a bunch of videos, articles.
Governance doesn't have to be confusing or inefficient. With the right structures and shared understanding, it becomes a tool for clarity, accountability, and decision making. We hope this video gives you a strong starting point for improving governance in your own co-op or in the co-ops that you support. This video is brought to you by Cooperation Works, a national network of cooperative developers.
As we wrap up today, we want to thank the sponsors that made the CW Equity Hub series possible. The CHS Foundation and the Cooperative Development Foundation have both provided funding for these first 4 videos. They fund a lot of great co-op educational work across the country, and you can learn more about them in the links below.
After recognizing our sponsors, we want to leave you with this. Cooperative development is both an art and a science. It takes practical skills, strong relationships, and people willing to work alongside communities to build something better together. Through our art and science of cooperative development training, which includes building blocks, toolkit, and finance fundamentals, we bring co-op developers, educators, and movement builders together to learn from one another and strengthen this work across our communities. You can continue learning with both of our experts featured in this video through our trainings. We hope you'll join us.